It's my great pleasure to interview today Guttenplan, otherwise known as Don, who is the editor of The Nation magazine, has been for about 2.5 years? Yeah, 2.5 years. And a longtime writer for The Nation, as well as former New York Newsday reporter and one-time editor at The Village Voice back in the day when I first met you. Let's have a seat.
Good. Are we going to have more ancient history or not?
So for those of you who haven't had enough coffee this morning, I'll start right into the heart of the matter. One of the things that we learned in the 2020 election is just how fragile and precarious the procedures are for certifying and ratifying votes in this country if a certain faction of the Republican Party doesn't agree with the outcome. And I'm wondering if you see what happened in 2020 as sort of the absolute worst case scenario, or are we looking at even more frightening outcomes in 2022 and beyond?
Okay, good. Let's start with the happy talk question. Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Jim, and thank you all for coming. I was going to quote from a sentimental movie, a favorite of mine, 1,000 Clowns, and begin by saying, "Good morning, rich people." But I feel like I should be saying, "Good morning, brave rich people," because you're all here, and I salute you for that. And I just want to say that it's fantastic to be here and to be talking to a bunch of people who may not all be Nation readers and perhaps spread the gospel about what we're doing a little bit. In the mode of plugging, I just want to say that I have a piece that's up on our site now and that quotes from a book I finished after the 2016 election called The Next Republic. And the quote is a quote from something that happened in the 1780s at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, when Benjamin Franklin was walking out one day and a noted Philadelphia hostess and political activist, she's the sort of person who would have been in Emily's List if Emily's List had existed in the 1780s, named Elizabeth Pole. And she said to him, "What kind of government have we got, doctor?" And he said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And I think, that question of whether we can keep it has become, I mean, to me, it was the salient question after the 2016 election, and seeing both the kinds of forces that had brought Trump into office. And, Jim will know this. I started covering Donald Trump for the Village Voice in 1985. I remember going to meet him even before that. I did a piece for Avenue magazine, which used to be distributed in these precincts. And I profiled his real estate lawyer, a guy called Sandy Lindenbaum, now better known as an art collector. But in those days, the guy you went to see if you wanted a zoning variance in New York. And I said, "Mr. Lindenbaum, is there somebody you can introduce me to who can tell me whether you're any good at this?" And he said, "Yeah, I've just gotten a great set of tax breaks for a young developer named Donald Trump." So he gave me Trump's number. I went over to see him. He showed me his, at that point, only slightly palatial residence. And I'd been paying attention to him ever since. So the fact that he would run for president didn't surprise me. The fact that the Republicans would let him stay on the ballot astonished me. And the fact that he won, scared me. So I think, yes, our republic is more fragile than we think. I don't think we've seen the worst. I think we do have a situation in which, inspired by Trump, who even in the early 80s clearly felt that rules were impediments meant for other people and not for the likes of him, the Republican Party has taken on that philosophy. But, there's a flip side to this, which is, remember, when the 2024 results are counted and the Electoral College reports, it's going to be Kamala Harris who has to decide whether to certify the ballots. And, one of the things, and we can talk about this, but one of the things that has frustrated me as a what's the word I want? Chronic Democratic voter. You know, a triumph of hope over experience every 4 years is that we never, you know, again, I think a lot of life and movie quotes. So we always bring a knife to a gunfight. And, you know, whether we're prepared to signal that whether you define we as Democrats or liberals or progressives or just opponents of incipient American fascism, that we are prepared to resort to the means necessary to prevent the triumph of evil, that's not clear to me. And to me, that's one of the scariest things.
Well, let's talk about that. What could that signaling look like? What would it look like? Whether it's from a procedural standpoint or a partisan standpoint, what are you talking about?
Well, I mean, I'm talking about flooding the zone, frankly. So yeah, procedural is a good place to begin. The filibuster. You know, why is the filibuster sacred? Why is Joe Manchin's sentiment more important than the vote of, you know, tens of millions of people of color who are going to be impeded, if not prevented, from voting if we don't get rid of the filibuster and pass the voting rights, you know, the voting rights bill? I mean, Republican state legislatures have shown that they have absolutely no scruple in blocking whole groups of people that they don't think are mostly going to vote for them from voting. And, you know, in a democracy, voting is the right from which all other rights spring. So voting has to be sacred. And if you treat voting as just a fungible political counter, you know, like office holding or patronage, that's really, to me, dangerous. And yet it's clear that Republicans, at least in state governments across the country, are prepared to do that. So are the Democrats prepared to fight back with the same sense of urgency? And the first sign that they're not is Joe Biden folding on the filibuster. But again, procedurally, the Supreme Court, you know, as the nation, the nation's been in business for 156 years. So we have a long institutional memory, and I wrote the history of the nation, so a lot of that institutional memory lives up here. In 1937, Franklin Roosevelt found that all of his laws were being vetoed by the Supreme Court, which had a big overhang of judges appointed by Herbert Hoover and Calvin Coolidge. And so he tried to, what he called, reform the court, what his opponents called pack the court. The Nation, and particularly I.F. Stone, the Nation Washington correspondent, whose biography I once wrote, were very supportive of this effort, but it was seen as overreach, and politically, in some sense, it failed, although in another sense, the Supreme Court immediately changed its tune. Once Roosevelt made it clear that he was serious about removing judges over a certain age or appointing more judges, once he was serious about using all the political levers that were available to him within the Constitution. In other words, he was not proposing to disregard the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that there are have to be 9 justices. There were originally 7. You know, I think actually there were originally 5. In any case, they've been added to periodically, and there's nothing that would prevent Joe Biden, while the Democrats have a majority in the Senate and a majority in the House, from increasing and appointing 3 new justices, 4 new justices. Now, of course, you know, then the Republicans, if they get back in power, could do the same thing. And in a sense, that would be to expose the court for what it really is, which is a political institution who, again, bearing in mind the long memory of history, mostly acts to protect the interests of property against the propertyless.
I should add to the audience that we have another session later today with David Shore, who's a sort of noted critic of the contemporary Democratic Party. So if this is your interest, you should make sure to watch that session as well. Don, while we're on the topic of Biden, you know, one of the things I hear a lot of people asking, particularly in the second half of this year, is, you know, unemployment is now down at kind of near record levels. The infrastructure bill that recently passed contains some wildly popular elements. And yet, if you look at Biden's approval numbers, they're very low, considering all of the other economic factors that we used to think determine the popularity of an incumbent president. Why do you think that is, and do you think it'll stay that way?
Why do I think that is? Well, I think the shortest explanation for why that is was offered by Biden's predecessor from the 1970s, Jimmy Carter, who said life is unfair. You know, I mean, by most metrics, Biden is one of the most progressive and successful presidents we've had in terms of passing bills, getting appointments, managing COVID, although, you know, that seems to be potentially unraveling as we speak. But people expected transformational change. They expected a transformational administration, and they have a kind of steady as she goes administration. Now, you know, am I, as a card-carrying socialist? My card, by the way, is a membership in the British Labour Party, so sort of a weak water version of socialist. Do I think Biden is my guy? No, but do I think that he's infinitely better than Trump? Obviously. You know, if the choice again is Biden and Trump, God help us, I won't have any compunction voting for Biden again. But in the country, I mean, one thing you have to recognize, and you know, it's lovely to be among a potential exception to that rule, is that the concentration and conglomeratization of American media means that the voices that defend privilege, defend entrenched wealth, are hostile to economic democracy in any form, are much, much more powerful than they were in the 1970s. You know, I mean, just one man, Rupert Murdoch, has, you know, who's inimical to everything that Biden wants to do, has enormous influence in the American media. And the landscape for progressive media has become much more challenging, I can tell you. I had more hair when I started this job. So.
Don, one of the things that makes you such an interesting editor of The Nation and political observer is that for the last several decades, you spent a lot of time outside of the United States. You kind of live in London, or you have lived in London.
I lived in London, I fess up.
Can you talk a little bit about the deterioration of democracy in this country versus what it looks like in the UK? We don't have to talk about the North Shropshire by-election, but I am curious, you know, whether Brexit, for example, kind of got some of that Trumpian energy out of the British system so that it can now maybe return to something a little more normal, or is that a fantasy?
That's a fantasy.
Okay.
No, it's interesting. I mean, I have a good friend who's, because he is a good friend, I won't mention his name. He's in the House of Lords. And as soon as Brexit passed, he rang me and he said, you know that this means that Trump is going to win. And I said, oh, you're crazy. You know, Britain is Britain. Brexit has its own set of factors and causes, and Trump is different, and Americans are different, and we won't be swayed by the same sort of gullible snake oil as you Brits. Well, you know, famous last words. No, I think, let me reframe it a little bit. I mean, I lived in Britain for 25 years. I think that British politics has become much more like American politics, so that a politician like Boris Johnson, who, by the way, was born in New York and could have run for president instead of prime minister, and only gave up his American citizenship shortly before becoming prime minister. And in part, that was because the IRS kept bothering him to file tax returns. Anyway, Boris, part of his appeal electorally is that he's a rule breaker. And people like that in Britain, but they're still attached to the rules. You know, he gets a personal exemption. People don't want to throw away the rules. So in that sense, it feels less dangerous in Britain. Although, you know, the costs of having an egomaniacal rule breaker in charge during a pandemic have been high in terms of human life, the NHS not being able to respond particularly adequately because it hasn't had adequate resources. So there have been costs, but it's different. And on the other hand, and this is where I want to reframe a little bit, I do think we're in a kind of, we're in a stage in the zeitgeist where there is a kind of populist energy that's going all over the world. And I think you see it in the US, you see it in Britain, you see it in France now, you see it in Hungary, but you also see it, you know, in Honduras. And I guess what I would say and have written is that this populism, this sense of anti-elite revolt and deep dissatisfaction with the status quo and with the existing distribution of goods and power can take a left form or a right form. You know, in the 2000s in Latin America, we had this pink tide and it looked like it was taking a kind of a left form, but it quickly degenerated into authoritarianism in many countries. And in America, you know, we had Occupy Wall Street, we had the Sanders campaign, and both of those in their very different forms seem to me to be channels for a kind of left populism that had a transformative potential, which we at the Nation were very excited about and which we did whatever we could to support and lift up. But, you know, when that door was closed in 2016, Hillary Clinton made it clear she was not in any sense a populist. You know, there was nothing much that was going to change. Certainly if you were somebody in, you know, Warren, Ohio or Western Pennsylvania and you'd seen your town decimated by what we didn't yet recognize was the opioid epidemic, but also by decades of deindustrialization carried out just as vigorously by Democratic presidents as Republicans, you know, there was a real hunger. I covered the 2016 election for the Nation, so I went to like 22 states in 2016, and you could see that people were desperate for change, and that part of what was behind Trump was just the clear sense that he would represent a break with this business as usual. Now that people know him, I think he's actually would be electorally weaker in 2024, in addition to being older and perhaps more doddery and also perhaps under clouds of indictment, let us hope. But I still think that there is a real hunger for fundamental change, not just in America. You know, we live in a new Gilded Age in which, you know, plutocrats have the money to send themselves up in space in rocket ships, but friends of mine who are labor doctors, labor meaning delivering babies, not meaning organized labor, in city hospitals in the Bronx have to beg for trash bags for PPE. So, you know, I like to think that that degree of inequality and immiseration in conjunction with sort of shameless wealth, aggrandizement, and hoarding is unsustainable. And it takes increasing amounts of naked power to sustain it. Now, you know, I'm in the end also a congenital optimist, so I believe that if you grind people enough, they will revolt. But
Let's, I didn't get to ask half the questions I wanted to, and that's fine, but let's close then on an optimistic note. When you survey the American political landscape now, where do you see signs of hope?
Oh, I see signs of hope all over the place. I see, for example, the fact that Amazon couldn't get rid of Kshama Sawant. I thought that was really hopeful. You know, it shows that money has its limits in politics. I think that, and we are about to publish a piece by our strikes correspondent. One of the things I did at the Nation when I took over was name a woman to be our strikes correspondent because we thought there were going to be a lot of strikes. She points out that although there were a lot of strikes in 2021, there weren't even close to the number of strikes that there were in 2018, which were nowhere near the number of strikes that you saw in 1936 and 1937. So, you know, labor is clearly in a very weak position in the American economy, but it is at least getting off its back and off its knees. And I see that as hopeful and something we want to encourage. I think, you know, that, and this is probably pure sentiment, so I can't give you an analytical case for this, but we ran a piece yesterday by Steve Phillips about the Beto O'Rourke campaign in Texas, and it basically says Texas can turn blue and Beto is the candidate who can do it. Now, I was in Texas in 2017, partly covering Beto's run for Senate, but also covering some other congressional races in Texas. And I think he is an extraordinarily talented politician, although he clearly wasn't ready for presidential politics in 2020. But I think, yeah, I think, you know, if you take Texas out of the equation as a stronghold of reaction, that changes the political balance of forces right there. You know, and Steve's point was Stacey Abrams has done the work to take Georgia out of the equation, at least for the moment. It's finally balanced, but you know, demography is in the end running in our favor. It's not destiny. I hate Democrats who think that all we have to do is sit back and wait for demography to save us. But it is in the long run in our favor, and in Texas it is as well. And if that process can be speeded up by a Beto Senate campaign taking out one of the most reactionary members of the Senate, that would be transformational.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Don Guttenplan.